The office was abuzz with the usual energy, a mix of clattering keyboards, ringing phones, and the faint hum of fluorescent lights. Yet, amid this daily chaos, there was one man who went almost entirely unnoticed: John, the janitor. For years, he had quietly swept the floors, wiped down desks, and emptied trash cans, blending into the background like an invisible fixture in the office. No one bothered to acknowledge his presence, much less engage in conversation. To most, he was just a nameless, faceless figure, a cog in the machine whose only purpose was to ensure the office remained clean. But beneath the uniform and the mop bucket was something more, something far more significant than anyone realized. John had seen it all: the power struggles, the whispered gossip, and the overlooked moments that shaped the very core of the company. No one had ever bothered to ask his opinion, but today, things would be different. It all started like any other Monday morning. The CEO, a man named Douglas, had called for a crucial meeting, one that would determine the future direction of the company. As the employees trickled into the conference room, John did his usual rounds, pushing his cleaning cart down the hallway, unnoticed by everyone. He didn't mind. Of course, he had long accepted that he was a shadow in this corporate world. But on this day, something was different. There was an air of tension in the office that John hadn't seen before. The usual banter was replaced by hushed voices and sideways glances. The employees were nervous, unsure of what the meeting would bring. But John wasn't nervous. He'd seen these kinds of meetings before, where the bosses talked in circles, and the employees played their parts. It was all a game, one that had been going on for years. And John had come to understand the rules of this game better than anyone. As the meeting began, the executives took their seats around the large conference table, their faces a mix of determination and uncertainty. Douglas, as usual, took the lead, presenting his vision for the company's future. But John, who was standing quietly by the door, couldn't help but notice the disconnect in the room. The employees seemed disinterested, their eyes glazing over as Douglas droned on about profit margins and expansion plans. John knew they weren't listening. They never really did. They were too busy playing their own games, positioning themselves for the next promotion or trying to stay out of the line of fire. The janitor, on the other hand, had no such pretensions. He didn't care about titles or power struggles. He cared about the truth. And the truth, as John saw it, was that this company was on the brink of disaster. The decisions being made in this room would only make things worse. But no one was paying attention to the little things, the details that could make or break everything. That's when the idea struck him. Without a second thought, John walked into the conference room, his footsteps echoing against the polished floor. The chatter stopped immediately, and all eyes turned to him. The silence was deafening. For a moment, no one knew what to say. The janitor, the one they had all ignored for so long, was standing in the middle of their important meeting. John didn't wait for an invitation. He walked up to the head of the table where Douglas was still standing, looking stunned. "Have something to say," John said, his voice calm but firm. The room was frozen. Everyone looked at each other, unsure of what to do. It wasn't every day that the janitor interrupted a high-stakes meeting, especially one involving the company's future. But John wasn't asking for permission. He had a point to make, and he was going to make it whether they liked it or not. John cleared his throat and began speaking, his words cutting through the tension in the room like a knife. "You're all missing something," he said, his gaze sweeping over the executives and employees alike. "You're so focused on the big picture, on numbers and strategies, that you're ignoring the most important thing: the people." The room shifted uncomfortably, as if they hadn't expected such a direct challenge from someone they had dismissed for so long. But John wasn't done. "You think you know what's best for this company, but you're blind to what's really happening on the ground. you're making decisions that don't take into account the people who do the real work, the ones who are holding this place together while you all sit in here pretending you know what's going on. His voice grew stronger with each word. The truth is, you can't lead if you don't listen to the ones who matter most, the ones who actually see how things work day to day. And you've ignored me and everyone like me for too long. Well, not anymore. The room was silent. John had spoken. And now, everything had changed. The office was in its usual rhythm. Desks filled with employees clicking away on keyboards. Phones ringing, the endless hum of fluorescent lights, and the occasional burst of laughter from the break room. Among all of this activity, however, there was one individual who went unnoticed every single day. John, the janitor. To most of the staff, he was invisible, just another cog in the machine that kept the office functioning. They never bothered to learn his name or even acknowledge his existence beyond the faint sound of his mop moving along the floor. John never minded, of course. He had been cleaning this office for years. He had witnessed all the drama, the petty office politics, the power plays, the quiet frustrations of those climbing the corporate ladder. He knew more about the inner workings of the company than anyone realized. Yet, despite his years of observation and quiet understanding of the dynamics at play, he remained a shadow in the building until one fateful day when everything changed. It was just another Monday morning, a day like any other. The CEO, Douglas, had called a critical meeting, one that promised to chart the company's course for the future. As employees trickled into the conference room, murmurs filled the air. John, meanwhile, continued his daily routine, pushing his cleaning cart along the hallways, emptying trash bins, and silently mopping the floors. He had seen the schedule posted in the break room earlier that morning. He knew this meeting was going to be important, but he had never been one to get involved in office affairs. His job was to clean, not to engage in the business of the executives. Still, as he passed by the glass walls of the conference room, he noticed the tense energy in the air. People weren't joking or chatting like they usually did. Instead, there was a nervous undercurrent, a sense of something significant hanging over the room. He couldn't shake the feeling that this was a turning point. It was a feeling he had learned to trust over the years. John had spent more than enough time in this office to understand when things were about to change, and something was about to change. As the meeting began, the room settled into an almost eerie quiet. The usual banter was absent, replaced by a tense anticipation. The top executives took their seats, their faces a mix of concentration and anxiety. John could see through the glass that Douglas, the CEO, was standing at the head of the table, preparing to make his pitch. He was a confident, self-assured man, at least on the surface. To most people, he came across as a visionary, a leader with grand ideas for the company's growth. But John knew better. He had witnessed the small, insidious cracks in Douglas's leadership over the years, how the CEO rarely listened to those beneath him, how he ignored the concerns of his employees in favor of grandiose plans that lacked any real connection to the day-to-day realities of the office. It was easy for someone in a position of power to lose touch with the people doing the actual work. And that's where things had started to go wrong. John had seen the disconnect, the growing frustration. Among the staff, it was no longer just about profits. It was about people being left behind. John was cleaning the floor outside the conference room when Douglas started speaking. The words coming from the CEO were predictable talk of profits, expansion, and a bright future for the company. But as John swept the floor, he couldn't help but feel a rising frustration within himself. The employees in the meeting were nodding, smiling, offering the occasional murmur of agreement, but they weren't truly listening. They never did. It was as though they were simply going through the motions, their minds elsewhere. For John, this was nothing new. He'd seen it countless times before. an executive trying to impress the room with grand promises while ignoring the real issues at hand. But today was different. Today, John wasn't content to stay in the background. He had seen how the company had been stumbling, how decisions made in these very meetings had led to missed opportunities, poor morale, and a growing sense of disconnection. And yet, no one was addressing the real problems. No one was listening to the people who actually understood what was happening. That's when it clicked. John knew exactly what had to be done. Without thinking twice, John pushed open the door to the conference room, his cleaning cart rolling behind him. The room fell into an immediate silence, and every eye in the room turned to him. For a brief moment, no one knew how to react. There was John, the janitor, standing in the midst of an important company meeting. He wasn't supposed to be here, wasn't supposed to be in the room with these executives who controlled the company's future. But John wasn't there to apologize for interrupting. He was there to make a point. He walked up to the head of the table where Douglas stood frozen, and without missing a beat, John spoke. "I have something to say." His words hung in the air, and for a moment, the tension was palpable. The room was paralyzed, unsure of what to do or say. This wasn't a situation that could be easily brushed off. It wasn't every day that the janitor, someone they had all ignored for years, suddenly took center stage. But John didn't care. He had been observing, learning, and now it was time to speak. The game had changed. John stood in front of the table, facing the stunned executives and employees who were still grappling with the shock of his interruption. "You're all missing something," he said, his voice steady but firm. The words sliced through the thick tension in the room. "You're so focused on the big picture, the profits and the numbers, that you're ignoring what really matters. You're ignoring the people who make this company what it is, the ones who do the real work. I've been cleaning this office for years, and I've seen how things have changed. I've seen how you've all become so absorbed in your own agendas that you've forgotten the very people who keep this place running." The room shifted uncomfortably, and John could see the executives exchanging glances, unsure of how to react. But John wasn't done. He took a deep breath and continued. "You all think you know what's best for this company, but you're blind to the reality of what's happening on the ground. You're making decisions in these meetings that affect people you never even think about. You've ignored the janitors, the receptionists, the people working in the back office, the ones who actually see what's going wrong, and that's why everything is falling apart. It's not about the numbers, it's about the people." John's words hung in the air, his voice unwavering as he spoke with conviction. The room was still, every eye trained on him. He had their attention now, and he wasn't going to let go. You can't lead if you don't listen to the ones who actually understand the day-to-day workings of this place. The people who know what's going wrong and what needs to be fixed. You can't keep making decisions from the top down and expect them to work. It doesn't matter how many grand strategies you come up with if you're not willing to listen to the people who have to make those strategies work. I've been cleaning this office for years, and I know what's really going on here. I've seen the broken systems, the frustrated employees, and the missed opportunities. But you all just keep pushing forward like nothing's wrong." His words had become sharper, his tone filled with frustration. "Well, I'm not standing by quietly anymore. You're not going to ignore the ones who actually know how things work. Not today, not anymore." There was a long pause, an uncomfortable silence that stretched out like a taut wire. The executives exchanged nervous glances, their previous confidence crumbling under the weight of John's words. Douglas, the CEO, finally broke the silence, his voice tight. "John, we appreciate your input, but this meeting is no." John cut him off, his voice loud and firm. "You don't appreciate anything you've never appreciated anyone like me, but today you're going to listen. Because this is no longer about who's in charge. It's about fixing what's broken. And if you're not willing to listen, then this company is going to keep falling apart. For the first time in years, John felt the power of his own voice, the weight of his own perspective. And the room, for all its corporate hierarchy and professional facades, had no choice but to listen. As John stood there, watching the faces of the people who had once dismissed him, a strange sense of empowerment washed over him. For the first time, he wasn't just a janitor. He was a voice that had been silenced for too long but now demanded to be heard. The room was quiet, but John could feel the shift. The power dynamics were changing, and the executives who had once held all the control were now on the defensive. And for once, John felt like he had the upper hand. Because when it came down to it, it wasn't about titles or positions. It was about who had the courage to speak the truth. And John, the janitor, had found that courage. Now it was time to see what would happen next. The room remained eerily silent. The air seemed to hang heavy, thick with tension, as John's words reverberated in the conference room. The employees, previously fixated on their phones, laptops, or gazing absent-mindedly out the window, now sat with wide eyes, unsure of how to react. The janitor, their invisible colleague, had just entered and demanded their attention in a way none of them had ever anticipated. And in that moment, they realized something fundamental. John was no longer the invisible man behind the broom. He was someone with an opinion, someone who had been watching and listening for longer than they could have ever imagined. They had all assumed that the only thing he knew was how to clean the floors, how to empty the trash cans. But now, John was making it clear that he knew much more about the true state of the company than anyone at this table could have guessed. For the first time, he was commanding the respect that had always eluded him. As John stood there, unflinching, Douglas, the CEO, tried to regain his composure. His brow furrowed, and he opened his mouth to speak, but the words got caught in his throat. How could he respond? How could anyone respond to a janitor challenging the very foundation of the company's leadership? The other executives, their faces a mix of shock and discomfort, remained frozen in place. They had all spent years building their careers on their credentials, their network, their polished appearances. They had been trained to present themselves as leaders, to act as though they had all the answers. But here, in front of them, was John, a man they had written off as insignificant, speaking with more clarity and insight than any of them could muster. Finally, after a few moments of awkward silence, Douglas cleared his throat and gestured for John to continue, his voice barely above a whisper. "What do you suggest we do, John?" John didn't hesitate. He had been thinking about this for years, silently observing as the company made mistake after mistake. He'd watched as the executives fought for promotions and positions, unaware of the toll it was taking on the employees beneath them. He'd seen the frustration building among the staff, the small, unnoticed signs of discontent that were beginning to affect morale. But it wasn't just about the employees, it was about the company's future. The higher-ups had become so detached from the reality of the office, so consumed by their lofty goals and their numbers, that they didn't see the damage they were causing. "You need to start listening," John said, his voice steady and firm. "Not just to each other, but to everyone in this building. The people in this room are out of touch. You're so focused on projections, on these abstract goals that have no grounding in the day-to-day operations, so that you've forgotten what makes this company work in the first place. It's the people. It's the people who are busting their backs to meet deadlines to keep things running. You can't lead from a place of detachment. You need to roll up your sleeves and listen to those who know what's really going on." For a moment, the room was silent again. The employees exchanged glances, some nodding in agreement, others looking at their shoes, uncomfortable with the sudden shift in power dynamics. John's words had cut to the heart of what had been wrong with the company for so long, and no one could deny it. They had all known, deep down, that something was off. The constant churn of turnover, the increasing absenteeism, the declining morale was all a symptom of something greater. And yet, no one had dared to address it. No one had taken the time to actually listen to the people on the front lines. But now, John had laid it bare. And in that moment, a few employees felt a flicker of hope. Maybe, just maybe, this was the turning point they had been waiting for. Maybe they didn't have to keep silent, keep enduring, keep playing along. John had done something none of them had the courage to do. He had called out the truth, and now it was out in the open. Douglas finally gathered himself, cleared his throat, and looked at John, his voice strained but genuine. I understand. Your point, and you're right, he admitted. We've lost sight of the people who make this company run. I've been so focused on our goals, on our numbers, that I've forgotten what really matters. There was a collective gasp from the room. The CEO had just admitted that he was wrong. The executive who had once been seen as infallible, the man at the top, had acknowledged that the foundation of the company was cracked, and it had been for a long time. It was a rare moment of vulnerability, and for the first time in years, the employees felt a glimmer of hope. But John wasn't satisfied with a simple admission. He wasn't here for half measures. Talk is cheap, he said, his gaze unwavering. You can say you understand, but understanding isn't enough. You need to change how things are done. You need to open the lines of communication between every level of the company: the janitors, the receptionists, the project managers, the assistants, everyone. You need to create an environment where people feel heard, where they feel valued. That's the only way you're going to turn this around. The meeting continued for another hour, but it was clear that everything had changed. John had taken the reins, and the executives were now following his lead. They asked questions, they listened, and for once, they genuinely engaged with the people they had overlooked for so long. They even invited the janitors, the custodians, and other staff members to provide feedback, something that had never happened before. It wasn't a complete overhaul, and it wasn't an instant fix, but it was the beginning of something new. John's words had planted a seed, and it had started to grow. The culture of the company was beginning to shift, albeit slowly. But John knew that change wouldn't come overnight. It would take time. However, he was hopeful. For the first time in years, he saw a glimmer of a company that might actually care about its people. And that was a victory in itself. A few weeks passed, and the changes began to take root. John's advice had not been forgotten, though it wasn't always easy to implement. There were moments of resistance, as there always are when trying to shift the dynamics of a deeply entrenched system. Some executives were still reluctant to let go of the old ways, the top-down decision-making that had served them for so long. But more and more, the voices of the employees were being heard. There were town halls, feedback surveys, and even casual lunches where staff members at all levels could speak freely with the leadership. It wasn't perfect, but it was a start. The morale of the company began to improve, and with it, productivity and engagement. John had seen firsthand how a lack of communication could breed frustration. Now he was seeing the opposite: an office that was starting to work together, a team that was beginning to rebuild itself from the ground up. As for John, his life had changed as well. No longer just the janitor, he became a symbol within the company of what could happen when someone from the bottom spoke up. His colleagues who had once ignored him now greeted him with respect. Some even asked for his thoughts on different aspects of the company's operations. John wasn't seeking fame or recognition. He was content knowing that his voice had been heard and that change had begun. He knew there would still be challenges, that the road ahead wouldn't always be smooth. But he felt a deep satisfaction knowing he had made a difference. He had gone from being invisible to being a catalyst for change. The company didn't just survive, it began to thrive. The shifts that John had initiated didn't just improve profits. They created a culture of respect, empathy, and communication. The executives no longer saw themselves as distant leaders, but as part of a larger team, working together to overcome obstacles and celebrate successes. And at the heart of it all, John remained the unsung hero, the janitor who had seen it all, who had been ignored for years and who had finally spoken up. His message had resonated far beyond what he could have imagined, and as he continued his work, mopping the floors and cleaning the windows, he did so with a quiet sense of pride, because John knew something the others didn't. Sometimes, the most important voices are the ones that are least expected. If you've ever felt overlooked or underestimated, John's story is proof that your voice matters. Sometimes, all it takes is the courage to speak up. If you enjoyed this video and want to hear more stories like this, make sure to hit that like button and subscribe to the channel. And hey, leave a comment below what's one time you spoke up and made a difference. We'd love to hear your story. Thanks for watching, and don't forget to share this video with someone who needs to hear it.